generous gift, as you saw I sent in the email, but thank you all again. I should have said before I started recording, but very sweet of everybody. Okay, so we come to the end, both the end of the book and then also what is thematically, as we're going to see, the end. I mean, that's the theme, is the end. So you can all see the Daniel text here? Yep, okay. So again, just as far a note on the text, all I've done is just given some headings. The translation is the ESV, but I've just divided it up a little bit if you happen to look at that. So like all this bit here, the first end, and these little dates here, 550, 500, these are very rough dates. I've deliberately made them, rounded them to the nearest 0 or 00, just to make it easier on the mind. And it's just kind of laying out what this period talks about, because it gets really convoluted as you go through reading. If you just read these chapters 10 to 12 and had no guideline, no notes, no divisions whatsoever, it gets very confusing. Particularly in chapter 11, where you just have what seems to be endless back and forth conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. And the Daniel in the vision is not even being told specifically that it's a new king, that there's different kings. It just keeps referring to the king of the north and the king of the south. And this all gets, to say the least, it can get very confusing. So let's just kind of spend a little bit of time on how it all is kind of laid out, the structure of it, so that it starts to get at least a little bit more simple. There's no way we're going to cover all the details in just this one final session here of our study, but at least to give you some handlebars. Hopefully that will help. All right, so it begins, or rather, let's just talk about the biggest structural thing. That the opening here, I've titled the divine figure appears. Okay, and that divine figure is right here in orange, a man clothed in linen. So Daniel is by the river, the Tigris River, and he's with a group of people, and a vision appears, and the others go and hide themselves and don't see the vision. So there's some sort of, rather dramatic visual auditory shockwave that hits Daniel and his little band of people and his attendants, and they all run and hide, and he stays beside the river, and he sees this vision. And the vision is of this extraordinary person. It looks like a man who's clothed in linen and is wearing a belt of gold, and they appear to be like beryl, which is like emerald. Their body appears to be like emerald. Their face is like flashing like lightning, and their eyes are like his eyes are like torches, flaming torches. His arms and legs are like refined brass when it's been burned, like it's just been burnished or refined. And then his voice sounds like the sound of a multitude. If you're familiar at all with the book of the Revelation, you'll know that this vision is almost exactly presented to John in chapter 1 of the Revelation. If you go and read the description, it's almost exactly like this. And the linen here, by the way, is not described as white linen, but the assumption is the cotton was bleached. They almost always, to our knowledge anyway, it was common practice to bleach the linen, to bleach the cotton, and so that it was white. And so anytime you just see a reference to linen, you should assume it's white. In the book of the Revelation, it describes it as white specifically. Anyway, but of course, the vision in chapter 1 of the book of the Revelation is a vision of Jesus Christ. And so it's doesn't seem to be at all a stretch in terms of the Bible, if you're just taking the Bible on its own terms, that the vision here back in Daniel, if you didn't, they wouldn't have known it. Daniel wouldn't have known it at the time per se, but that it's the second person of the Trinity, as we call him, the Lord himself, Jesus, the Son of God, that appears to Daniel beside the river. And what he tells him is he's going to reveal what's in the book of truth. And that comes up right here. I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. And remember, the second half of the book of Daniel is about a series of writings. And this one is about the book of truth, and the truth about the end of the world is what that is referring to. Okay. And so what happens after that then is chapter 11 is the contents of that book of truth. What is in the book of truth? And you get the contents. And it's a delineation of a back and forth conflict and between the king of the north and the king of the south. And that at first, I'll explain just a second what that's about. But basically, it's just what seemingly is a back and forth warfare. And then in chapter 12, you finally get the end of this conflict, and you get a reference to the resurrection, that many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. In other words, it's a very it's clearly a final vision, if you want to call it that. And you get a reference to the time of the end. And then after that, Daniel closes up what is after then that revelation of the book of the truth, the contents of the book of the truth. You see Daniel again at the bank of the Tigris River, now describing the vision of the fact that there was the man clothed in linen again, but there's also two other people, one on each side of the bank of the river, and the man clothed in linen is actually above the waters of the river, in the middle between the two people on either side. Okay. And then they discuss the timing. There's lots of references to time, like 1290 days and 1335 days. Okay. So there's the discussion of the timing about this vision from the book of the truth. Okay. So it begins with a vision of the Son of God at the beginning in chapter 10. And then you have the revelation of the contents of the scroll of truth, which is basically describing what seems to be a back and forth warfare. And then you get at the end another vision of the man, only now he's above the river. He's described as being above the river, and there's two people on either side, and there's this discussion about the timing. Okay, so that's the basic architecture of the story of the vision. Okay, now let's go back to chapter 10, and let's look at what it's about. It says that we're in the third year of the king of Cyrus, King Cyrus, king of Persia, that this vision comes. So this is around 537 or so BC, if you want the exact date, but I think I just put it at 600 or something like that on your map, or on your timeline there. And it says the word was true. It was a great conflict. I take that to mean that the vision that comes is not only true, but it is describing a great conflict. It's the vision that Daniel is about to see is about war and warfare. Okay. So that's the first thing to note. Right off the bat, we're told that it's going to be warfare. And of course, early on, we discover that it involves the prince of Persia and the Persians and the Greeks and so on. And it just occurs to me, I think I have a map. Sure enough, I do. Let's pull this up. Can you see this map right now? Yeah. Okay, so here's this map. Might be a little bit small. I'll try to make it a little bigger. But here you can see Greece here, right? This is let's make them red, I guess. So this is Greece here. And I'm including Macedonia in the north because that's where Alexander the Great and the Alexandrian campaign comes from. Let's see if I can make that just a little bigger. Let's go to 6 point. All right. So we have that. Then over here, we have all of this, which is clearly Persia. And you can see if I pull the map down, it goes way out to the Indus River. Okay. And eventually included Egypt as well. So this is a pretty substantial area that the Persians ruled. Okay. And you can also see that, well, keep in mind the four empires that are significant in the book of Daniel, right? The first is Babylon. Then the Persians eclipse the Babylonians. And then the Greeks defeat the Persians. And then finally, the Romans come and defeat the Greeks. All right. But at this point, we're just concerned about the Persians who rule first, all this area here. Okay. The Persians. And they've got all this territory. And they're ruling a mighty empire, by far the largest empire up until that point in world history, so long as we know, or so far as we know. And then you have this little empire over here, which is a very small world of the Macedonian Greeks. And what happens, of course, you can predict, is that the Persians attack the Greeks because they want to spread their empire. So they attack the Greeks, okay? And it doesn't work out so well. They even though Greece is very, very tiny, they're able to defeat the Persians. And if you know anything about Greek history, this is the period of the classical Greeks, and this is the period where the Parthenon is built, and if you know, out in front of the Parthenon, the Greeks take all of the armor and the weaponry that the Persians left on the battlefield at Marathon. You know the story of the Marathon, right? The runner for the Marathon, right? It's the first marathon. It's the Battle of Marathon where the Persians are defeated by the Greeks. And the Greeks take all that bronze and they melt it down and they recast it in a giant statue of Athena. And they put it out in front of the Parthenon on the Acropolis. Okay, so this is very, very famous battle where the Greeks defeat the Persians. Okay, and then 150 or so years later, you get Alexander the Great comes to power, and Alexander takes vengeance on the Persians by attacking them, and he pushes the Persians all the way back to the Indus River. Okay, and Alexander and the Greeks completely take over all of the Persian Empire. Okay, and after that, Alexander dies, and then his empire is divided into parts. Okay, and here's the most important thing I'm going to show you now, if you can even see it in the midst of all this mess. But you'll see up here, you get the king of the north. All this green stuff in here, this is the king of the north, okay? And then down here in Egypt, the Ptolemies are the king of the south. We don't quite know why for sure Alexander died. He died, by the way, in the city of Babylon. That's where he actually died. Okay, so down here is the king of the south in orange, and the green up here is the king of the north. So the king of the north rules Persia, Iraq and Iran. That's where the king of the north comes from. And the king of the south is from Egypt. And the southern rule is by the Ptolemies, like Cleopatra and her family. And then the king of the north is Seleucus and Antiochus and that group. All right, so enough of all that. Just to give you some sort of historical background, that's the map anyway, the geography of where the conflict lies. Oh, I should have said one thing about all this. Can I get all this out of here? Let's see how fast I can get it out. Why is all this so crucial? As we're going to see, because right here, right, if this is the king of the north up here, and this is the king of the south, what lies in between? What's in here? Anyone know? What's the land in between the king of the north and the king of the south? Yeah, Israel. Okay, that's why this warfare is so important. Okay, so we have this great conflict. And what we discover as we read through the decades and decades and decades of warfare and what's ultimately going to be centuries and millennia of warfare is that at the center of all this conflict is the temple in Jerusalem. Because the temple in Jerusalem is what is the temple? Well, it's the house of God, right? And what that means is that you have this one location where earth and heaven intersect. There's an intersection of earth and heaven. So if you live on earth and you want to know anything about heaven, then this is the one place you can go. This is why the Queen of Sheba traveled that great distance to Jerusalem to witness the worship in the temple, because what she discovered is this utterly unique temple. She didn't go to Athens or anywhere else. She went to Jerusalem because its temple was unlike any other temple in the ancient world. And I've spoken quite a bit about this in the course of our study. So this is heaven on earth. It's the witness of God. That's why you'll see constantly a reference in the Old Testament to the tent of testimony. That is to say that the tent or the tabernacle, what became the temple, was a testimony. It was a witness to the one true and living God, creator of the whole of the heavens and the earth. So this is where you could learn about him. And what we discover is the temple, the witness of God, is at the center of all this warfare. Why is that? Is it just politics? Was it just that the Greek generals that were the vestiges of the Alexandrian Empire, the Greek general and his community in the north, the Seleucid Empire, and the Ptolemaic Empire in the south, also Greek ruled? Was it just that all these Greeks were so bright and intelligent and smart that they knew all this, and so they were deliberately trying to create problems and to suppress the witness in the temple in Jerusalem? And the answer, of course, is no. That's not. They weren't themselves generally viewing Israel as sort of their tack on a map, their bullseye. They were just in the way. They were just the borderland between the two Greek empires. And they just happened to be the place where many of the great conflicts occurred. In fact, one of the most important and massive battles that is described happened in Caesarea Philippi, which is the area where Peter gave his famous confession that Jesus is the Christ. And Jesus said to him, "Upon this rock I will build my church." That happened in Caesarea Philippi, right? So there's this great conflict that just happens to be taking place constantly in the borderlands between the two empires. And that means the armies are traveling back and forth, trampling down Israel, and occasionally taking out their frustrations against Israel. And Israel played a crucial role in the political frontier between the two armies. If it's a little bit like if you know anything about World War I and trench warfare, the one place you don't want to be is out in the no man's land between the two trenches, which is precisely where the land of Palestine was taking place. Okay, so there was this great conflict. Yeah, exactly like the movie 1917. This conflict is, of course, something we've already been hearing about. We heard about it in chapter 9. Remember, we went into at the end of that chapter. It spoke about in fact, let me pull that up real quick. It spoke about that warfare. Let's see, what's this? This I think should do it. Here, not quite chapter 9. There it is at the end. So we had all this discussion about the sort of conflict that would take place involving the little horn and the problems regarding the most holy place, meaning the temple, that the temple was at the center of all this conflict. And of course, all of this in Daniel 9 is describing the discipline of God on the nation of Israel, and on there was described this 77s or 70 weeks here, which are 70 times 7 years, 490 years. And so when we get to Daniel 10 to 12, we get yet another vision of this period of conflict and of discipline, but now elaborated in more detail. Remember, each of the visions in the second half of Daniel, each one is supplementing the earlier visions and giving a little bit more information. So that's chapter 10 to 12 gives us the most detailed information, even though from Daniel's perspective, this was all sort of telescoped. You know, it was it all can collapse into one little small telescope, but we can look back on it and see the telescope sort of stretched out and the different lenses occurring at different periods of history. But it was not so clear to Daniel when he was looking at it from the other side of the telescope, so to speak. Okay, now one of the things we learn right away about this great conflict that comes up in chapter 10 is you have a spiritual dimension to the conflict. And we haven't had that described quite like this in the earlier visions. So not only do we get this vision of this glorious divine figure who appears to Daniel, and Daniel falls flat on his face, prostrate before him, before the divine figure who's going to give the vision. But in addition to that, we learn that the divine figure was delayed in coming to Daniel. He wanted to come to Daniel, but he was delayed. Why was he delayed? Well, it says in chapter 10, verse 13, that the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. Now, that is not a reference to the king of Persia, like Cyrus or Darius or Xerxes. This is a reference to a spiritual being from a spiritual dimension who somehow is an authority directly connected with the kingdom of Persia. He has authority. He is a prince, but he's a spiritual being. He's an angelic being, but he is not one who is fighting on the side of God for the cause of God. He opposes the cause of God. That is to say, he's I guess you'd say, he's a demonic being. He's what from in New Testament terms, and only hinted at in the Old Testament, really, is a fallen angel. All right? He's a spiritual being opposed to the rule of God, a fallen angel that works against the cause of God, and he's operating directly within the kingdom of Persia. Now, the kingdom of Persia initially was the kingdom that sent Ezra and Nehemiah back to Israel, to Palestine, to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city. So in many ways, and which fulfilled the 70 years from Jeremiah, mentioned in Jeremiah 25, chapter 25. And so initially, the kingdom of Persia seems to be favorable to Israel and helps Israel to begin to rebuild the temple. But of course, that's not the whole story. And there are many, many, many problems as you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. It becomes quite clear that there is serious conflict between the local rulers who operate underneath the Persians and the Jews, the Israelites, who are trying to rebuild the temple and the city. They have constant conflict and problems. All their efforts constantly are being thwarted and obstructed. So it makes sense anyway that there is some demonic power that is operating and is opposing the cause of God under the Persian Empire. Okay, so that's the first thing to note about this vision, is that right off the bat in chapter 10, where we're about to be told about warfare and the conflicts, what we cannot do, says the great Son of God who appears to Daniel, is to think that you can explain all of this conflict merely by politics and all of the earthly demands and needs and selfishness and desires of the rulers of Persia and of Greece. It's true that there are earthly kings and they have their own will and their own plans, but they're not the only wills and desires that account for everything that's happening. There are spiritual forces that are operating and influencing the outcomes and the results and the kings who rule the various countries. Okay, so it's a spiritual warfare. Remember earlier in the book of Daniel, we described the nations and their kings. We saw the description of them as animals. That is, creatures who in their behavior are like the beasts which dwell beneath human beings. They're underneath human beings. But now we learn that there are creatures above human beings who are operating directly in concert with the kings, or at least influencing the kings, the humans who rule these Gentile pagan societies. And when we read of these kings worshiping various gods, you'll hear them occasionally say that they carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and so on. That, of course, is to say that the gods that these pagan kings are worshiping are powers that are indeed supernatural powers, but not altogether, but not good powers. They're being influenced by evil powers and are ignorant of how evil those powers are. So the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me, and that warfare occurs in a spiritual dimension. And what happens? Michael, one of the chief princes, it turns out Michael is the chief prince associated with Israel, the country of Israel, and Michael comes to help the Son of God. It's an interesting idea, isn't it? An angel coming to help the Son of God. You might think, well, that doesn't make sense, does it? But then, do you all remember what happened at the temptation? What happened after Jesus was tested by the devil? Who came to Jesus and helped Jesus as he was in the desert outside of the Jordan River Valley? Yes, it was angels. Exactly. Angels came and helped him. Anyway, for some reason, the Son of God allows, even at the spiritual dimension, he allows the need for angels to play a role in helping him. But then don't you and I somehow help him? Aren't we helping him on earth? Doesn't he conscript us into the great war and ask us to serve and to help him? So anyway, Michael comes to his aid and helps him. And then here we see in chapter 11, it says in the first year of Darius the Mede, which is of course a couple of years before the vision. This is a few years before the vision. The Son of God says that in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to comfort and strengthen him. Who is the him? Michael. The Son of God stood up and helped Michael and strengthened him as the Persians took over the kingdom of the Babylonians. Okay. So anyway, all this is to say that unique to this final vision in the book of Daniel is the introduction of a spiritual version, a spiritual dimension, where we discover that there are forces above the mere politics of this world that operate through the politics of this world. Okay. Let's take a look for a second at the verse in Ephesians, the book of Ephesians. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. Hold on a second. Hit the wrong thing. A window. All right. So I want this one. Or maybe I think this. There you go. Let's see if it comes up this time. All right. So that comes up the right way, I think. Ephesians chapter 6. You all may know this verse. Verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Okay, so that's a statement from Paul saying that though the Christians were being persecuted by Roman and Jewish rulers and leaders in different cities across the Roman Empire, he was encouraging the Christians not to think that the politics and the human machinations by leaders was the only layer of explanation and cause for the conflicts they were enduring. There was a spiritual dimension that was the primary dimension, that the rulers were often just pawns in a larger game. All right. So there you have it. Paul sort of affirming the kinds of lessons you get from the book of Daniel. All right. So go back to Daniel here. So the spiritual dimension, and what's the primary concern? Well, it's the temple in Jerusalem, of course, because if you can get these armies fighting and moving their whole armies across the land of Palestine and occasionally taking out their frustrations on Palestine, then you can do damage to you can frustrate the witness of God that's presented in that temple. And God, of course, is allowing it because the nation is being disciplined for its long sin and rebellion against God that we find in the described in chapter 9 of Daniel, and of course described in Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on. All right. So that's the first big part of our lesson, is there's a spiritual dimension. The witness of God is the primary concern. Notice, by the way, in the midst of all this, that you get this little interesting reference to men of violence. Look at this little phrase here. It says, the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Okay, and this is in the context you see here of this reference to the land of Israel. This king shall stand in the glorious land, that's Israel, with destruction in his hand, and so on. So it's talking about Jerusalem and standing in the Holy Land, the land where God chose to put his name. And what we're told is that there's Daniel's own people. There will be some who are inclined toward violence naturally, and they will get involved in the politics. And they will try to fulfill the vision. In other words, they get involved in the political machinations, thinking that by controlling the political machinations, they can themselves fulfill the purposes of God through the politics. But they fail. Why do they fail? They fail because the warfare that we're engaged in is not primarily about politics. It's not primarily a political fight. That's not to say that politics never has anything to do with the great spiritual conflict for the witness of God in the world. Absolutely, as this whole story is telling us in the vision, that politics play a role in what's going on in the spiritual conflict. But it's not primarily or ultimately a political conflict. And therefore, the vision cannot be fulfilled through mere politics. The great plan of God, the purposes of God, the testimony of God in the world will not ultimately find success and victory through political machinations. And I think you all can attest to the fact that sometimes Christians forget this. And Christians get to thinking that the great warfare is all politics. And if we lose a political fight, then that means we're losing the great spiritual fight. Or if we win a great political fight, then that means we're winning a great spiritual fight. And the two aren't always so aligned. And believers in God have to be very careful, as the Son of God warned Daniel in the vision, to make sure that we never forget that the primary dimension of the warfare is spiritual. And the politics can often seem like they're destroying God's purposes when in fact they're fulfilling what God's will is for that particular phase of history. And there was a lot of suffering and political defeat during the years that this vision describes, particularly leading up to the coming of the Son of God. But that didn't mean that God's purposes were not advancing at the same time. Okay? So that's very hard, as you can imagine, that is very hard to keep in mind. You have to steel your mind. And it's one of the reasons we read visions and books of the Bible, is to remind ourselves what the ultimate truth is and the dimensions we're dealing with. Okay. Now, the next thing to discuss, again, we're not going to be going through this verse by verse or even paragraph by paragraph. We're just talking about some of the leading themes that run through it. So the next thing that is to discuss are the endings, the series of endings. And to do that, let's first just notice how many times there's a reference to endings. We see it. I think I marked some of them. Here we go. Yeah, they're in green. All right. So here In the ESV, it says after some years. That's how it reads in English. But in the ASV, it presents the Hebrew in a more literal way. The Hebrew says, and at the end of years. And there's our word, the end, or end. And then it again, in the ESV here, it says after some years. But as the footnote, I think, tells you, the English actually, or rather the Hebrew, is at the end of the times. Oops, I meant to add, no, it's not adding it. Anyway, at the end of the times is what it's supposed to say. There you go. At the end of the times. And then here you go a little farther and it says, for the end is yet to be, meaning it hasn't happened yet, at the time appointed. Okay, that's another reference to the end. And then here we have an explicit reference. It says, until the time of the end. And then verse 40, chapter 11, at the time of the end. And then chapter 12, note now it picks up, until the time of the end, and till the end, and until the time of the end, and till the end, and at the end of the days. How can you miss it? The theme is the end. And as you get to the end of the end, the end of the vision of the end, you get a cluster of references to the end, because you've reached, so to speak, the end of the end, as I think Churchill would have put it, and not the beginning of the end. Okay, why might this all be important? Well, let's look back at our structure. You remember the structure of the book, and we had at the end of the first half of the book here, chapter 5. What was this about? Well, this was about the end of the empire of Babylon, and how Belshazzar, oops, I just realized for the first time here, I forgot an L. Do you see that right there? It says Belshazzar. Whoops. I kind of like Belshazzar. But anyway, it's supposed to be Belshazzar, typo. But this is where Belshazzar, the prince regent, the last king, so to speak, of Babylon, it dies, and the empire of Babylon ends, and there's a judgment on Babylon. Remember, he saw the handwriting on the wall. He saw the finger of the hand writing on the wall, his own judgment. And that was the end of Babylon, the judgment of the Gentile empire of Babylon, and the death of its king. And what was unique about this king Belshazzar? Do you remember what he did? He wanted to stick a finger into the eye of Yahweh, because when he had his orgiastic party, he didn't just want to get drunk. He called for the cups and the bowls and the treasures that came not from the temples in Egypt or in Syria, but for the temple in Jerusalem. And he wanted to get drunk out of those cups. And then he worshiped the gods of gold, the pagan gods, and so on. He wanted to flout his power over the Jews and their very, what he considered bizarre religious beliefs, their exclusivism, that they thought they had the true God and nobody else knew the true God. Okay, it was any number of reasons you can imagine he might have disliked them and perceived them as being arrogant. Okay, that was the end. And now we come to the end of the second half of the book, and again we have a story about the end. Only this time it's not just the end of one of the pagan Gentile emperors. It is the record of the end of all of the world empires, the final judgment and the resurrection of the dead. where some go to everlasting shame and contempt. Notice the word everlasting. It's a final judgment, and they go to everlasting shame and contempt, and others enter into everlasting life. So that's the final judgment. And then there's a king, isn't there, in this vision of chapters 10 to 12. There's a king who is uniquely opposed to Yahweh. Okay, and let me read the description of him. He is, by the way, the little horn that's referenced in chapters 7 and 8. And I think myself, he's also referenced at the end of chapter 9. But how is this person described, this king? Well, it says this. It says, he will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods, meaning Yahweh. So this one king will be unique among all the kings of earth. Not any, by the way, of the Persian or Greek kings ever were quite like this description here in verse 36 of chapter 11. This king here that's described in verse 36 is the little horn that will come at the end of history, who is going to exalt himself even above God himself. If you read the book of the Revelation, you know he's described as one of the beasts coming up out of the sea. And he demands that people worship, eventually he demands that people worship him, and bans the worship of God, Jehovah, according to the Revelation. All right, now somebody had in other words, Belshazzar was a kind of prototype of that final king who is to come. Now somebody asked a question here, which was, if the implication is the end in the ESV, why don't they say that? Well, what they're trying to do, Elizabeth, is the ESV is just trying to give expressions in English that they think readily convey the idea in Hebrew. And I wouldn't really fault them for not translating these expressions really hyper literally. Occasionally, if you translate it literally, it might create a little confusion for an English reader. Okay. But you'll note here in this verse here in chapter 11, verse 14, verse 13, you'll notice that there's a little footnote here, and in the margin they give you this English at the end of the times, so you could see that in your footnote. Now they didn't do that for the earlier one here. There's no footnote on this reference here. Okay, I wish they would have done that. They didn't do it. That's okay. They're not perfect. And you can't footnote everything. This is why it's good to have a translation of the Bible that is very literal, which is why I recommend everybody get the ASV. It's free online. You can just bookmark it, or you can get it on a Kindle for free or whatever. It's very cheap since it's free. And that way, when you're really studying a book like we are now, in addition to the normal Bible you read, you also have another one, the ASV, which is very literal and will bring some of these little details out that can help reinforce what the major themes are in any one passage. Okay. Now, anyway, it's all about the end. Okay. So, and the way it works, the kind of logic of this is, as you begin to get the vision, okay, it breaks down into 4 sections. And the first section is what I have described here as the first end. I saw this idea in David Gooding's notes. He had some notes or something on this, and that's where I first heard this. But what I'm about to say, I don't know if it at all is the way he would put it. I'm just telling you that's where I first got the idea. But what you have is a series of endings. And what I mean by that is that that each of the sections of the vision bring you to a point where the Israelites might have thought they were experiencing the end, or about to experience the end, as Daniel describes it in his earlier visions in chapters 7 and 8 and 9. Okay? But these endings will not be the end. They will only be points that are approximating the end, or anticipating what the end might be like, but they're not actually the end. Okay? And so the first one comes in the first couple hundred years, as you can see here, the different things that happen. Persian rule is established. Persia attacks Greece. Greece avenges Persia, and then which is Alexander the Great, and then the northern king, which is of Greece, that is a Greek king in the north, eventually defeats a southern Greek king. And all of this, as I show in the parentheses, is tied in to what's going on in Israel and the story of that temple. So the real story behind all this conflict is what's going on in the temple. And of course, Daniel knows this, at least some of it, because when Daniel is seeing this vision, the Persians have already commissioned the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. So when Daniel gets the vision, the temple is already beginning to be rebuilt. All right? So just know that that's all sort of assumed in the background through what you and I know from the books of Nehemiah and Ezra. Okay? And of course, what's going to happen is eventually there'll be a point where the end will come at the end of this time frame, just this time frame here, toward around 200 BC. That's the end of years, or the end of the times. That's referring to the end of this period of the vision. That when the northern king defeats the southern king, that Israel will be its most vulnerable. And as it says here, this is at the end of that period, that the northern king will stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. But with all the power he has to defeat Israel, he doesn't actually do it. He has, for the first time, complete domination over Israel, because he now dominates the southern king. So the south is gone. There is no southern king to sort of give relief to Israel. And so the northern king has complete power, so to speak, but he doesn't actually assail Israel or directly attack Israel. He returns to the capitals of the Seleucid Empire in the north. Okay. Now, the second end, the next phase of the conflict, is not quite like that. Antiochus now begins to really get involved in Israel and begin to create all sorts of problems for the witness of God in the temple. But then that isn't quite the end. Note what it says here at the end of that part of the vision. It says the end is yet to be. So it might have seemed this is around 170 BC. It might have seemed like that was going to be the end, but instead, it didn't quite happen then. And then there's this next phase where Antiochus returns, and now he takes out with brutal rage his persecution on Israel, directly profaning the temple and setting up the abomination that makes desolate that we read about in chapters 8 and 9. But this is still not the end. Instead, what Daniel has in his vision is an encouragement to the wise, that they will suffer, they will stumble, but they will, through this persecution, they will be refined and purified and made white until, all the way until the time of the end. Meaning it's not yet the time of the end. They will endure, and the wise will need to persevere until you get to the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Okay? And then the vision skips, of course, over long periods of time. It doesn't go into Rome. It doesn't go into the persecutions that happened through the European empires. The British, or what are they called? The Crusades. For some reason, I couldn't get that word out. Like in the periods of the Crusades, or the Inquisitions, or the Nazis, and so on. You're skipping over vast periods of time. And when you get to verse 36, the description of this king here, again, is the little horn who comes, and now note the expression, note what it says. It says, at the time of the end. Not until the time of the end, but at the time of the end. You finally get this king who will come and cause all these problems at the end, who will finally be judged. He shall come into the glorious land, and so on. He will do things like Antiochus did, but at a much more severe scale. In fact, it says that at the time of the end, that the great Prince Michael will be involved. And there shall be a time of distress and trouble such as never been since the nation, there ever was a nation till that time. So this period here at the end with this king will be like similar to the previous endings, but much, much worse. And then will come the time of the great resurrection and the final judgment and so on. Okay? So that's how it's kind of laid out in terms of the structure of the vision. And then we have one thing left to cover, and then we'll be done. Okay, we're not going through all the details. And the final thing we have to cover, which is it won't take us too long, but it is this idea that the Son of God is appearing to Daniel at the great river. It's an interesting thing. He appears to him at the great river. In fact, really important at the end of the vision is this detail that the Son of God is located, he is situated above, note that word, above the river, above the waters of the river. It says it twice. He was above the waters of the river. Everybody else is on the banks, on the shore, but he's above the river. Now, why might all that stuff about a river have anything to do with this vision? Okay, so what we need to do is we need to look very briefly at one verse from Isaiah. All right, Isaiah chapter 8. And where is that? Oh, there it is. All right, so you're seeing, am I right? You're seeing the ESV now, right? Isaiah 8. So you're seeing Isaiah 8? Just one of you nod. Yeah, okay. So you're seeing Isaiah 8. All right. So this is a prophecy about the king of Assyria. and how the king of Assyria will attack Israel, and his armies will defeat the northern power of the northern tribes. But notice how he's described. It says, behold, the Lord is bringing against them, meaning against the northern tribes of Israel, the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria and all his glory, and it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks, and it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass on. In other words, the armies of Assyria, when they come, will be like a river that's flooding. You don't want to ever live through a river that's flooded, right? Not only does it bring death, but it sweeps all the material objects in its wake. And then eventually, when the river recedes and goes back down into its channels, what's left on the banks of the river is all the flotsam and jetsam and mess, broken down trees, ruined gardens, destroyed houses, and just stuff littered all over the land, not to mention dead bodies. That's the effect of an army passing through, because when an army went through an area, it ate all the crops. It burned down houses of anybody they thought were aiding and abetting their enemies. They killed people that were abating, that they merely suspected of scheming with their enemies. So that's what happened. Okay, is an army came through like a river. And notice when these armies are described here, notice how they're described. It says, his sons will wage war and assemble a great multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through. Doesn't that sound just like Isaiah described the armies of Assyria? Like a river that passed through. And here it says it again later, right here. He shall overflow and pass through. So this is borrowing the language of Isaiah, where the armies that are going across the lands of Palestine are like giant rivers that are overflowing their banks and destroying the region and the people in those regions and causing great suffering. Okay, so that's the first layer of the issue of the river, and then there's one more, and then we're done for the day and done for the spring. Okay. And this one is a little bit more interesting. It's the idea of the Son of God being above the river. Okay. Y'all, have you ever thrown or maybe dropped an object into a creek? And when you go to try to reach in and grab it, sometimes it's not easy to find it, even if the water is fairly clear. Why is that? Why is it hard? Like if you dropped it into your pool in your backyard, say you drop your keys, you could reach in and grab your keys, no problem. If you drop a key into a little creek, you can't, it's a little hard to find it. Why? Yes, exactly. That's right. Because the water is moving. And so your eye has a hard time keeping fixed on the object down on the bottom of the creek or the river or whatever it is. Because a river is always moving, and it's always moving in one direction. It's always moving forward, so to speak, by definition. Okay, it's always moving. It's always going forward, and it never stops. Does that remind you of anything? Well, that's what time is like, isn't it? That's why the old philosopher said, Heraclitus, you can't dip your toe into the same river twice, because time is always moving forward. We can't go back and re-experience yesterday. In that sense, the river is like time. Okay? And time is moving forward. You see, Daniel is next to a river, and the vision he has is about the future, is about time going forward. But you see, if you and I are standing beside a river, say you were standing beside the Mississippi River at Lake Itasca, which is in northern Minnesota, that's where the Mississippi River begins. And if you're standing next to the Mississippi River when it's just a little creek coming out of the lake, you can't look down around the bends of that creek and see what it's doing as it heads to the south, can you? Because you're limited when you're next to the bank of the river. You can't actually see around the bend and see where the water is going. And you would have no idea that eventually that little creek becomes this massively wide river, say in St. Louis, as it goes through Missouri and provided all those great stories Mark Twain wrote. You just wouldn't even think of that. You can't see down the river, you see. You can't see down the river. But where is the Son of God situated in our vision? He is situated above the river, which allows him to see down the river, right? The Son of God can see what Daniel and the people on the banks of the river cannot see, because he's situated above the river. So herein is the source of Daniel's courage. How can Daniel face the vision of all these difficulties and all these troubles that are going to come upon his people in the many decades and centuries ahead of him? How can he do that? When he sees the vision, he falls on his face flat. Where does he get the strength to stand upright and to face the truth of the vision and to encourage others to persevere? He draws the encouragement from the Son of God and the glorious vision of the Son of God, who it presents himself as the great victor. His vision is the vision of one who will win the great conflict. He appears as the great victor, and he can see the end, and he can appoint the end. He has the power to dictate the end. That's why when we get to this final vision of him being above the river, the discussion is about what? The discussion is about how long? What shall be the outcome? And how long shall this be? And we'll have a discussion of the blessing of those who wait and arrive at the ending based on this time frame. He is dictating the timing of the end because he's in control of the end, and he will win in the end. And Daniel one day will stand in his allotted place, which just means his inheritance, that the Son of God already has a place allotted for Daniel, and Daniel will stand in his inheritance, and he can have that confidence regardless of what particular phase Daniel exists in this large warfare. He can have the confidence that he'll be raised from the dead, and he will stand in his lot, his allotted place, his inheritance. And of course, you will know that Jesus spends a lot of time talking about our inheritance. And Paul talks about our inheritance, that we will one day stand in our inheritance at the end. And we should take courage in this, that God has already won the great conflict. And we can be encouraged that even if in our day we play some small role in this great conflict, and it seems like we're in a phase where it feels like the end is about to come, that it may not actually be the end. And there may be much more that God has for in the future. And the things we do now will play a role in that. Let me ask you this. What Daniel did, has it played any role in the future? The witness of Daniel? Well, Daniel wrote a book, didn't he? And eventually people read that book. And some of the people who probably read that book eventually came hundreds of years later to the little house in Bethlehem where the Messiah had been born. They were from the lands where Daniel had written his book and probably had read his book or heard anyway the message of his book. So Daniel's life is a reminder that the witness you and I have in the world today will reverberate like ripples across the water, the surface of the water. And we can play a role in the future. And our lives will have an impact for good or for ill in other people's lives, and so on. And so that we have value and eternal significance in playing our role. And the goal is to keep our head above the water, so to speak, and keep a vision from above the water, from outside of time, and not be dragged into all the little petty conflicts of our phase and buy into all the nonsense that asserts that all sorts of things like we might be living through the end and so on. Well, maybe we are living through the end. We may not be living through the end. We have no idea. It's not for us to determine that. Unless, of course, someone shows up like the vision here in chapter 12 about at the end of chapter 11 about that final king who demands to be worshipped. If we have a king like that shows up in our day, then definitely I would tell you we may be at the time of the end, which, by the way, is why Daniel is told to seal up his vision until the time of the end. The vision is shut up and sealed, not meaning we can't read his book, but meaning the truth of the end is not yet happening, and therefore it needs to be sealed and protected. The sealing up is a protection to make sure that we hold the truth of it in our minds and pass it on from generation to generation until the end, so that those who are living through the end will be able to recognize they're actually living through the end. And those of us who aren't actually living right now through the end will be able to discern that we're not actually right now living through the end. And therefore we can be encouraged that there is much to do and not to get deflated by seeming defeats to God's plans, but to keep our chin up and to steel our witness for God in the world. Anyway, so I need to close it up, but much more to say. There's lots actually more to say about chapters 10 to 12. I wish I could say a whole lot more, but that's enough, I think, to give you sort of a framework for how the book ends and where this vision is headed. Anyway, it's been great. Let me close the recording just for a second. Stop presenting. No, I don't do that. Stop recording.